Good evening. Tonight, I have 4 stories to share with you, 4 disasters from human history, some of which you may never have heard before. Before you get comfortable, please hit subscribe and leave a like if you haven't already. And now, let us begin with tonight's 4 stories. The 2019 escape room disaster. On the 4th of January, 2019, a house in the Polish city of Koszalin suddenly caught fire, claiming the lives of 5 teenagers. The tragedy shocked the nation not only because of the devastating loss of young lives, but also because the building was being used to host a form of entertainment known as an escape game. The concept underlying most live escape games is relatively simple. Players are locked inside a room and must solve a sequence of puzzles in order to get out, with the final puzzle unlocking the door to freedom. While this format is the most common, there are variations in which participants must instead complete different missions, such as finding a particular object in order to win. The forerunners of live escape games were, in fact, digital ones. As early as the late 1980s, text-based adventure games appeared in which the objective was to escape from a locked room. These soon evolved into online escape room games, often flash-based, that became extremely popular in the early 2000s. In 2007, Takao Kato, an employee at the Japanese publishing company Scrap, happened to notice a colleague playing such a game online and began to wonder if a similar experience could be created in the real world. Not long afterward, Takao began organizing live escape games by renting space in bars and clubs. The events quickly proved immensely popular, attracting international attention. By the early 2010s, escape games had spread to Europe, America, and beyond, becoming ever more sophisticated. In their earliest iterations, escape games were little more than a collection of unrelated puzzles in a plain room, relying on simple devices such as padlocks, combination locks, and keys. As competition increased, however, companies began to create elaborate, movie-quality themes, compelling storylines, and technologically complex puzzles. Yet, at that time, almost no country had introduced specific regulations to ensure safety within escape rooms. The phenomenon was too new, and since no fatal accident had yet been recorded, government oversight was minimal. For many years, escape games were subject only to the same general safety rules that applied to any public business. Even so, among escape game designers and operators there remained a persistent unease, a recognition that, sooner or later, an accident arising from the unique qualities of these games was bound to occur. During the 2010s, a handful of accidents occurred inside escape rooms, but most were minor incidents such as slips, falls, or collisions. The few mishaps linked directly to the unique features of escape games tended to be slight. A guest startled by a special effect might stumble, or someone might receive a scrape from bumping against a door. Everything changed on the 4th of January, 2019, when a fire erupted at an escape game facility in the city of Koszalin. The building contained 4 themed rooms, but only one was occupied when the flames broke out. Inside were 5 high school students, each just 15 years old. Elsewhere in the building, the sole employee on duty was monitoring the game through a camera system. The premises were heated with gas cylinders, and later it was determined that a leak from one of these cylinders had sparked the disaster. Gas had escaped from a faulty connection. The employee smelled it and attempted to shut the valve, but the fuel ignited before he could act, creating a wall of fire that sealed off the waiting area. The blaze blocked access to the room where the 5 teenagers were trapped. Although the room had windows, they had been sealed shut to maintain the theme. And of course, the only door designed to be unlocked by solving puzzles was locked. In theory, the emergency plan required the employee to unlock the door from outside in the event of a fire, but with the flames raging, that was impossible. The fire brigade was called at 5:15 p.m. and arrived within 6 minutes, at 5:21. By then, however, all 5 teenagers had perished from smoke inhalation. One of the victims managed to call her father before losing consciousness, uttering only a single word: "Help!" The lone employee was injured but survived and was taken to hospital. The sudden loss of 5 children devastated the city of Koszalin, while the manner of their deaths raised deeply troubling questions. The investigation revealed that the facility had originally been a residential home, converted for business use without informing local authorities. As a result, it had never been inspected to commercial standards. Had such an inspection taken place, even though Poland had no specific regulations for escape rooms at the time, many hazards would almost certainly have been identified. Players were routinely locked inside rooms with no means of opening the doors themselves, even in an emergency. Windows and alternate exits were often sealed, leaving escape entirely dependent on staff. Had there been even one accessible emergency exit, the 5 teenagers might have stood a chance of survival. The owner of the facility, the injured employee, and several others were arrested. The proprietor faced charges of deliberately creating a hazardous situation and of unintentionally causing the deaths of 5 people. The teenagers were memorialized in a solemn service at the town's cathedral, where hundreds gathered to light candles in their memory. The impact on the escape game industry in Poland was profound. The government immediately ordered inspections of more than 1,000 venues nationwide, completed within a matter of months. At least 13 facilities were shut down on the spot for failing to meet basic safety standards. Many others were forced to make changes, and some closed permanently as bookings plummeted. The effects rippled far beyond Poland, reaching nearly every country where escape games had become popular. This was the first fatal accident of its kind, and it was devastating. Many nations launched large-scale reviews of escape rooms. Dozens were temporarily closed until renovations could bring them into compliance with local fire codes. Even so, most countries still have not enacted laws specific to escape rooms, relying instead on general safety standards for entertainment venues. In parallel, many operators and designers reassessed their own practices. Today, locking participants inside a room is rarely done. Almost all escape games now include at least one emergency exit that remains open and clearly marked. The industry continues to grow, becoming a familiar form of entertainment worldwide. Alongside that growth, knowledge of how to build and operate safe facilities has expanded. Regulators have become more adept at inspections, and safer technologies have been devised to replace older, risques practices. The Sunvalley Mall disaster. On the 23rd of December, 1985, the Sunvalley Mall in Concord, California was packed with people. With only 2 days remaining before Christmas, shoppers crowded in to grab last-minute gifts, bring their children to see the mall's Santa Claus, or catch a film in the 1,500-seat cinema. It was a bustling yet entirely ordinary day until, quite suddenly, it was not. At precisely 8:35 in the evening, something came crashing down through the skylight above. Within only a few seconds, countless lives were changed forever. Buchanan Field Airport had been constructed in Contra Costa County, California, during the 1940s. Initially planned as a civil airfield, it was still unfinished when the United States entered the Second World War, and the Army Air Forces swiftly took it over. After several years of military use, peace returned, and the airport was handed back to Contra Costa County so that it could finally be opened for commercial flights. At that time, the airport lay about 1 mile from the center of Concord, the nearest city. Standing at either end of its runways, the view was of open fields broken only by the occasional walnut grove. For a fledgling airport, this lack of nearby neighbors was ideal, but that situation did not last. The airport expanded, offering more and more commercial services until, by 1977, it ranked among the 20 busiest airports in the United States. At the same time, Concord itself grew. Suburban developments spread outward, replacing pastures and groves with homes, roads, and shops. Before long, high-rise office blocks began to rise along the edges of Buchanan Field. This changing skyline stirred unease. City planners voiced concern about the placement of several particularly tall structures, and in 1985, one building was discovered to stand more than 2 meters, around 7 feet above the height permitted by the Federal Aviation Administration. The building was duly reduced to meet regulations, yet the concerns did not fade. The Sunvalley Mall, which first opened its doors in 1967, was not considered among the more pressing concerns. Located about 1 kilometer, roughly half a mile to the south of the airport, the low-slung structure seemed of little consequence. Though some flight paths did indeed pass directly overhead, the site was not regarded as hazardous. It was the taller office blocks that had begun to rise near the runways which most troubled city planners. The mall itself flourished. In its very first year, it hosted around 40 retailers, with major names drawing shoppers from Concord and the surrounding region. Over time, it grew to include a sprawling food court, a 1,500-seat cinema, parking space for 9,000 vehicles, and striking landscaping complete with vast murals, indoor gardens, and a multitude of decorative fountains. Large skylights set into the flat roof filled the interior with natural daylight, while still keeping visitors sheltered from the weather. For many years, Sunvalley Mall could proudly claim to be the largest fully air-conditioned indoor shopping center of its kind anywhere in the world. On the 23rd of December, 1985, the mall was thronged with last-minute Christmas shoppers. Many families had come not only to browse for gifts but also to see Santa Claus, who was appearing outside Macy's department store. He was a fixture of the holiday season, and at that moment about a dozen families were lined up, waiting their turn. Among them was 23 years old Kim Aguirre, who stood with her 3-year-old son Mario. Just ahead of them, a woman momentarily stepped out of line to retrieve her own child who had run off. With a polite gesture, she offered Kim and Mario her place, and they accepted gladly. Moments later, at approximately 8:34 in the evening, a deafening explosion tore through the building. The entire structure shook, glass and debris rained down like hail from above, and almost instantly a great fireball descended through the skylight, engulfing dozens of unsuspecting shoppers. The woman who had yielded her spot to Kim only seconds earlier was struck by a falling fragment. Kim herself was thrown to the floor, her clothing ablaze. All around, men, women, and children screamed as fires erupted across the concourse. Thick smoke filled the air. The mall's electricity failed. In the confusion of that moment, no one could fathom what had happened. Some believed it was a bomb, others thought of an earthquake or a gas explosion. Many fell into utter panic, unable to grasp how such an ordinary setting could so suddenly be transformed into a nightmare. One veteran of the Vietnam War later compared the sudden devastation to the effect of a napalm strike, but the fireball was not caused by napalm. It was aviation fuel burning, cascading downward after a light aircraft had smashed through the skylight above. At the controls of the Beechcraft Baron twin-engine aircraft was 67 years old Jim Graham, a seasoned pilot who had served during the Second World War and logged thousands of hours in civilian flight thereafter. He had even gone on to establish his own aviation services company. On that day, he was returning home after flying his company's secretary back to her hometown for Christmas. With him were two companions, one an aspiring pilot eager for the experience of flight, the other a close friend who had joined the trip simply to share the long journey and conversation. Now, all three men were trapped within the mangled fuselage, which hung broken through the collapsed skylight. Flames consumed the wreckage, leaving no avenue of escape. Each of them perished, whether from injuries sustained in the crash or from the fire that followed. Below, the torrent of burning fuel unleashed at the moment of impact turned the mall into a disaster zone. Nearly 100 people were injured. Some were doused in flaming aviation fuel. Others were pinned beneath falling debris of aircraft parts and roof material, including pools of melted tar. In the immediate aftermath, bystanders rushed to aid the wounded. Burn victims were plunged into decorative fountains to extinguish flames and cool their injuries. Display boards, decorations, even clothing were torn down and pressed into service as makeshift blankets and stretchers. Emergency services converged swiftly, summoned by more than 200 separate calls to 911. Dozens of ambulances lined up outside, ready to ferry the injured to specialized burn units throughout the county. The man who had been playing Santa Claus later recalled the moment when the fireball erupted. At first, he believed that nearby decorative lights had exploded. Then, a sudden wave of heat swept over him, and he fled. He noticed that his costume bore burn marks left by droplets of flaming fuel, yet he escaped without injury. Kim Aguirre and her young son also survived, though both were severely injured and required years of treatment after the disaster. Even as their physical wounds gradually healed, the psychological scars of such a horrific event remained with them for the rest of their lives. The woman who had given her place in line to Kim was badly injured as well, but ultimately survived. Her little boy did not. In total, 7 lives were lost in the tragedy. In the aftermath, the use of land surrounding Buchanan Field Airport came under intense scrutiny. Some mall employees admitted that they had long feared such an accident, pointing to the tall buildings rising near the airport and the frequent fogs that blanketed the area. In interview after interview, the same grim phrase was repeated: "It was only a matter of time." Even so, investigators determined that the buildings around Buchanan Field all stood within the height limits set by the Federal Aviation Administration, and were therefore, in theory, safe. The crash itself, they concluded, was not caused by the airport's surroundings. Instead, the National Transportation Safety Board suggested it might have been due either to a collision with an unidentified object in the thick fog, or to the pilot becoming disoriented. Several new commercial routes planned for Buchanan Field were delayed in the wake of the disaster, though not permanently canceled. In time, normal operations resumed. The mall, too, recovered quickly. Sections reopened the very next day, even before the wreckage had been cleared. Within a year, the entire complex had been rebuilt at a cost of roughly $3 million. Meanwhile, hundreds of lawsuits were filed, most of them targeting city planners. About $11 million were ultimately paid out, whether by judgment or out-of-court settlement. Today, Buchanan Field remains a busy and important airport. Sunvalley Mall continues to draw shoppers. Since the 1985 disaster, there have been 4 more small plane crashes in the vicinity, but in every case the aircraft have struck roadways or open ground, not buildings. Survivors of the Sunvalley Mall tragedy, however, still carry the burden of their injuries and the haunting memory of what unfolded that December night. The Aberfan disaster. At about 7:30 on the morning of the 21st of October, 1966, workers arriving for their shift at a coal mine near the Welsh village of Aberfan noticed that one of the spoil tips had shifted overnight. The foreman immediately ordered all operations halted for the day and began to inspect the situation. Yet while this work was still underway, at 9:15 a massive section of the tip suddenly gave way, hurtling down the hillside like a dark wave and crashing straight toward the village below. Coal mining produced a variety of byproducts. Alongside coal itself, a precious and widely used fuel in 1966, came waste rock and other material unearthed from below ground. These unwanted substances were typically piled into conical black mounds near the mine's entrance. Aberfan Colliery had 7 such tips, all perched on high ground above the village. It was tip number 7 that collapsed on that October morning, unleashing more than 100,000 cubic meters of debris. Almost instantly, 2 farmhouses in its path were obliterated, their occupants killed on the spot. Roughly half of the slide then surged onward, crossing a canal and railway line before slamming into the village itself. It engulfed Pantglis Junior School and destroyed 18 houses. Many other homes, as well as a secondary school, were left badly damaged. The terrible roar of the landslide soon gave way to an eerie silence. Stunned residents stumbled from their homes, confronted with scenes of devastation, and rushed to dig frantically for survivors using garden tools or whatever they could lay their hands on. The timing of the collapse could not have been worse. Most of the children of the village were already in class at the junior school. In total, 240 pupils between the ages of 7 and 10 were inside the building when the black tide struck. Rescue efforts focused desperately on the school. Fire crews and ambulance staff arrived quickly, joined by local miners whose own experience with unstable earth guided the digging. 36 people were pulled out alive and rushed to 2 nearby hospitals. Tragically, all of the survivors were found within the first 2 hours. After 11 o'clock, only bodies were brought up. Most victims had died from asphyxiation. The final death toll stood at 144, of whom 116 were children. A small chapel in the village, not far from the scene of destruction, was requisitioned as a temporary morgue. The space was cramped, but there was no better option. Families were admitted in small groups to identify the bodies of their children or to register the names of those still missing. Because the chapel was far too small for the sheer number of dead, many related tasks had to be moved elsewhere. Death certificates and cremation papers, for example, were issued from a nearby fish and chip shop. The search for victims continued day and night for 2 weeks. Excavating the mass of compacted debris was difficult and hazardous under any circumstances, but here the work was complicated further. The tip continued to shift because it had blocked a river and burst 2 water mains, sending a constant seep of water into the spoil. Only after the water supply was cut and a drainage channel dug did the site stabilize enough for rescue efforts to proceed more safely. News of the disaster, carried by the BBC, drew hundreds of volunteers to Aberfan. Though well-meaning, many of them only hampered the work of professional rescuers. At the same time, journalists descended on the village in large numbers. While not directly obstructive, their conduct was often condemned as callous. One reporter was even accused of asking a child to cry for the camera after the youngster's siblings had been killed. Burials took place as quickly as possible, many of them in large communal funerals. At Bryntoft Cemetery, on the 27th of October, 81 children and 1 woman were laid to rest in a single grave, witnessed by tens of thousands of mourners. A few days later, Queen Elizabeth herself traveled to Aberfan to meet the rescuers and pay her respects to the dead. As the funerals continued, attention soon shifted toward an inquiry. At its center was Lord Robins, head of the National Coal Board, the body responsible for the mine. His initial stance was straightforward. He declared that the board would fully cooperate to determine what had gone wrong. The physical mechanism of the disaster was quickly identified. The spoil tip had been placed directly on top of a natural spring, which pumped water into the pile continuously. Combined with unusually heavy rains in the days before the tragedy, This was sufficient to turn solid spoil into a slurry, triggering the collapse. On the basic mechanical cause, there was little disagreement. The more difficult question was whether the National Coal Board should have foreseen it. Many argued that they should have. After all, there had been warnings. In November of 1944, part of tip number 4 had slid down the hillside, stopping only about 150 meters from the village. Other, smaller slips had also been recorded. From time to time, residents had written letters to the board, voicing their concerns about placing the tips directly above Pantglis Junior School and complaining that coal waste blocked drains and caused flooding in the village. Remedies were promised, but never delivered. Those who raised objections rarely pressed too hard, mindful of the implicit threat that the mine might be closed altogether, wiping out most local employment. The inquiry found that a culture of disregard for safety had taken root at the mine itself. While underground safety was treated seriously, surface concerns about the spoil tips were consistently dismissed. To those in the industry, the dangers lay below ground, not above it. A special tribunal lasted 76 days before ultimately concluding that responsibility lay with the National Coal Board. This conclusion might have been reached far sooner had Lord Robins and the board not been so reluctant to accept blame. Indeed, the tribunal's report noted that much time could have been saved if the National Coal Board had not stubbornly resisted every attempt to place responsibility where it so clearly should have been. Meanwhile, the spoil tips remained in place, an obvious, looming threat to the village. Repeated pleas to remove them were brushed aside. Officials insisted they would simply be landscaped, and that the Aberfan slide had been a freak occurrence. Some villagers resorted to protest, hauling sacks of waste into the lobby of the UK's Welsh office. Eventually, money had to be taken from the Disaster Relief Fund to pay for the removal of the remaining tips. The process dragged on for years, in part because Lord Robins insisted the board should not have to pay. In the end, the bulk of the cost was borne by the government, with the board contributing only a fraction. The rest came from the relief fund. That money was eventually reimbursed decades later, but without interest, leaving the fund short by more than £1 million. Not until 2007 was a more fitting repayment made. Today, the fund continues its work, maintaining the Aberfan memorials and supporting survivors and the families of those who perished. The Victoria Hall disaster. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 16th of June, 1883, a children's magic show began at Victoria Hall, a theatre in Sunderland, England. The hall was packed with youngsters of every age, some 1,500 boys and girls, each of whom had paid a penny for admission. As the performers stepped onto the stage, none of them realized that nearly 1 in 7 of those children would never leave the building alive. Victoria Hall had been built just over a decade before the tragedy. It was a massive brick structure, designed in the Gothic style then in vogue. The main auditorium contained a stage and 3 levels of seating. The ground floor, a curved gallery above, and a lofty balcony still higher. With its vast capacity, the hall quickly became a familiar venue for public meetings as well as for many forms of entertainment. Music halls, variety acts, and concerts had all graced the stage of Victoria Hall. A magic show for children, therefore, was nothing unusual. This particular performance was given by a pair of traveling entertainers, Mr. and Mrs. Fay, whose handbills promised marvels, sleight of hand, talking wax figures, and other wonders designed to delight a youthful audience. There was another enticement as well. Each child admitted was promised the chance of a small gift, perhaps a little book or a toy. Few could resist such a lure. Hundreds of children scraped together their pocket money or pleaded with their parents for the single penny required for entry. By the afternoon of June 16th, the auditorium was jammed with excited voices as Mr. and Mrs. Fay took the stage. Their performance proceeded smoothly. They had given countless such shows across Britain, bringing joy to thousands of children. And this one appeared no different. Indeed, the only incident of note seemed almost comic. A puff of smoke from one illusion left a few children in the front rows coughing and retching. Otherwise, the young audience was enthralled. When the final trick was finished, the Fays announced that those holding specially numbered tickets would receive a gift as they departed. At the same time, they began tossing handfuls of toys and sweets down into the crowd. It was at this moment that events slipped fatally out of control. The gifts were thrown only to the children on the ground floor. Those seated in the gallery and balcony above received nothing. Disappointment quickly turned to agitation, and many of them rose from their seats and hurried downstairs to claim their share. The children, already overexcited from the performance, perhaps the most thrilling event of their young lives, were scarcely capable of restraint. Many were without parents to guide them, and most were very young indeed. They rushed for the staircases. At the bottom, a door led into the ground floor hall. On that day, the door had been secured so that it opened only to a gap of some 50 centimeters, perhaps to control tickets at the entrance. That narrow passage became a death trap. As the children pressed forward, one stumbled. Others tripped over the fallen body, while hundreds more surged down behind them. Within minutes, a heap of children piled up in the doorway, those at the bottom crushed beneath the weight of those above. Some accounts later claimed that the human pile within the corridor reached as high as 20 bodies from floor to ceiling. The horror was compounded by the turn in the staircase. Those still hurrying downward could not see what was happening below, and so continued to push forward, forcing those at the front into suffocation and death. Throughout the disaster, there were very few adults present. One of the first to grasp what was unfolding was the theater manager, Frederick Graham. He struggled desperately to pull children through the narrow gap in the door, but they were wedged so tightly that he could not free them. Instead, he dashed up another staircase and led some 600 children to safety through a separate exit. With the pressure eased slightly, other adults on the scene began dragging more youngsters out. At last, the door itself was torn from its hinges, and within half an hour every child, whether alive or dead, had been removed from the stairwell. The survivors were rushed to hospitals, while the bodies of the victims were laid out upon the pavement outside. The toll was staggering. Many had been crushed or suffocated. As word of the calamity spread, frantic parents flooded to the theater in search of their children. All too many found only the nightmare they most feared among the long rows of lifeless bodies. One account tells of a man who, after walking the entire line of the dead, collapsed in tears upon realizing he had lost not just a single child, but his whole family. Another report noted that an entire class from a local school had been wiped out. In all, 183 children perished in the crush, most from asphyxiation. The catastrophe became headline news across Britain and reached even Queen Victoria herself. She sent both her condolences and a generous donation to the relief fund established in the aftermath. That fund covered the funeral costs for all 183 children. Shops across Sunderland closed in mourning. An official inquiry was convened, but no one was found responsible. A second investigation, spurred by public outrage, reached the same conclusion. No one could say who had fastened the door so that it opened only to a narrow gap, nor who had failed to release the catch after tickets had been checked. Though it was the scene of so much tragedy, Victoria Hall remained in use for more than 50 years afterward, until it was destroyed by a German mine during the Second World War. By then, the building was considered both unsightly and a painful reminder, and its loss was scarcely mourned by locals. Mr. and Mrs. Fay faced criticism during the inquiries, but were not held accountable. Once the furor subsided, they continued their careers as traveling entertainers, though they never again performed for children, nor ever returned to Sunderland. A memorial was erected for the victims in Mowbray Park, not far from where Victoria Hall once stood. The marble statue depicts a grieving mother cradling her lost child. Despite relocations and repeated restorations, it endures to this day, now housed beneath a protective glass canopy in Mowbray Park to guard it against vandalism. Those were tonight's 4 stories. I hope that after hearing them, you now feel ready to drift off to sleep. But before you do, be sure to leave a like and subscribe so that when a new video arrives, you'll be among the very first to know. Farewell for now, and until we meet again.